Hey everyone, I'm Mike Henry, and this is my Procreate 5 demo for the piece I call the Maxx. Now it's of course called the Maxx because this is the Maxx from the comic book The Maxx. It was also turned into a cartoon on MTV called The Maxx. If you're not familiar with this, it's a great comic and a great cartoon, not a very long one, but it's still super good. About this character. I'm not even going to begin to explain the plot because it is a little crazy, and on top of that, I think it's something to be just sort of like explored yourself. I don't think really explaining much of it is that, it doesn't do it justice really. What you do need to know is I think that the Maxx succeeded so early because of just how striking he is. His visual is awesome. He's complementary colors. We got this bright purple and bright yellow. It's stylized like crazy. He's got these big buck teeth for some reason. He's got these giant brown boots, and I think that it all just sort of comes together in this very iconic, very symbolic sort of character. And by symbolic, I don't mean that it's symbolic of something specific, but that he was an icon for like 90s comic books, especially the sort of indie part of them. I mean, it was a quirky comic. It was very bizarre for the average person. If you loved reading Batman, actually, if you loved reading Superman, but you thought Batman was too dark, then you never even heard of the Maxx. But even if you didn't hear of the Maxx, you probably saw him because he was everywhere, especially if you got like Wizard magazine or you just walked into a comic book shop at the time. Him getting onto MTV was also, of course, a really big deal. And as a kid, I mean, when the Maxx was popular, I was actually 11 when the first comic came out, and then as he became more popular and got his cartoon and stuff, I of course was aging up through those early teen years. And when you're learning art and you're trying to figure out sort of like what's cool, sometimes it's the most striking, bizarre things that end up resonating with you. And I think that the Maxx was really important to me because I probably created like 100 characters that were more or less ripoffs of the Maxx after seeing the Maxx. Like something where you were taking those same basic principles of like this kind of hulking dude, but maybe he's not, you know, Superman strong looking, and then using these weird almost like, I mean, they're just like these implied hands. Of course, if you look at the comics, sometimes they're implied and they're just big shapes, and other times they're actually drawn, because the creator, Sam Keith, he has a awesome style, and it lends itself well to the Maxx being represented quite differently from even sometimes frame to frame, much less issue to issue, but having that really strong character design of the bright purple and the yellow hands and the big boots and the big buck teeth made it so that you could interpret him like millions of ways and you always were going to know who he was. I mean, that's the strength of superheroes in general, and one of the problems when we get much more complex, much more nuanced character designs is they're harder to interpret and in wildly different ways and still ring true. So the Maxx, I think, is like a masterclass in striking visuals and using unique techniques where like you render some things and you don't render other things, or some things are color and some things are just heavy shadows, and every now and then things get like crazy cartoony for some reason. It's just such an awesome, different comic book, and I think it inspired a lot of people, and I think some people even don't acknowledge it consciously, but we all experienced the Maxx back then, and it seeps in every now and then to our either design aesthetic or the way we want to tell stories or something like that. So that was a lot on the Maxx. I think the shorter version is just go check it out. It's awesome. And what I wanted to do here was I'm painting an older drawing that I did. I did this drawing in one of my sketchbooks. It's just pencil and then ballpoint pen and probably some Sharpie just to fill in some black or something like that, like around where his yellow, actually the part I'm painting in right now, where his weird yellow hands meet his weird purple body. And I've wanted to do colors on this for a while. I actually have this, I started coloring this in Photoshop not long after I drew it and like abandoned it for some stupid reason, and then I started coloring it again when I first got Procreate, and then abandoned it again, and then I found this version of the lines in Procreate and I decided to give them a new coat of paint. So what you see here when you look at the lines by his feet and everything is the feet got adjusted in Procreate. I brought it in and then saw there were some things I wanted to adjust, and I adjusted them. Unfortunately, that's not captured here, but I mean, it was really just cutting and shifting some things around for a second, so you're not really missing out on much. The important part here is that I'm going in with my new turpentine brush that's in my brush set, which is linked below, and I just fill in the flats really quick. If you've been using the new turpentine brush, you'll notice that there's some color variation built into that brush, which you can easily turn off if you would like to, but the thing I like about it is I've always talked about how the turpentine brush makes me embrace errors and sort of like little anomalies, and since this turpentine brush was a little more controllable than the original one that's in Procreate, I wanted to add some more of that sort of chaos to it. So when you can see actually right now in the purple and in the yellow specifically that there's a lot of subtle variation across there. It gets a little more saturated every now and then. It shifts hue just a little bit every now and then. And that's what we're seeing is the flats. The flatting process for this was pretty quick. It was a lot quicker because he's just got a few colors, but then when we get into the ambient occlusion pass, it's actually kind of time consuming on this one. The most time consuming things to do in art are the things that are the most complex. Sometimes complexity can be something really simple, like you're trying to hand paint the smoothest gradient possible or something like that. Other times it's about the complexity of the geometry, which is why when you're drawing the human figure, something like a average non-bodybuilder person's arm can be drawn in just like a couple of seconds, and a hand then takes a lot longer because you can think of it not in its precise anatomy, but every finger is like drawing another arm, and the hand is like drawing a torso. I mean, it's not actually that, but you see what I'm saying is that when we get to the hands, when we get to the feet, and when we get to the head, we collect a lot of detail in those areas. Now, if you have somebody who is very muscular, like the Maxx is here, doing things like ambient occlusion becomes much more of a big job. When you're doing AO on somebody like Mega Man, it goes very quickly. You're only capturing a few little bits where there's like shadow pockets and you're trying to get that kind of soft look otherwise. When you're doing something like the Maxx or Superman or Arnold Schwarzenegger or whatever, you have a lot more topology that you're trying to make sure you're capturing the form of. And so you'll see here that the AO part of this goes super slow. Also, I want to point out something that's happening in the background here. This little fuzzy outline that I'm putting around him looks like shit, and I do delete it in a second. Well, no, actually not in a second. I eventually delete it. But the point of what you're seeing here with the background that I wanted to capture was something that's in the Maxx comic, which is a lot of black and a lot of places where the black just hardline cuts and goes into some sort of a slightly textured, not too much variance in like value type of color job, which is what is starting to happen there in the background. You'll see more of it when we come back. By the way, I also forgot to caveat this whole video with I'm getting over a sickness and I'm still not technically well. It's just I want to make sure that I get this done this week because I think it's only going to be a one video week because I'm going to be playing catch up the rest of the week. So pardon any time where it sounds like I'm like starting to, I don't know, choke or something like that. It's because I'm starting to have a cough coming and then I have to quickly stop the recording so that I can cough. That said, I'm feeling much better than I was earlier in the day, so this should be okay. I realize when I breathe in I might sound a little wheezy, so again, sorry. I hope it's not too much of a pain in the butt. So what we're seeing at here is the arm getting its definition. Now, this is a prime example of why I say that I don't really do a strict AO pass. I do what I refer to as like a form shadow pass with AO, inspired by AO. I've talked about this in the past, and so I'm not going to belabor the point, but I want to, now that we're tight here on this arm, I want to point this out. In order to make sure that all the definition of his muscles is captured, I'm going in and making sure that I am like really sectioning out these muscles. I mean, you can see it in the line art that they're very defined, and I want to do that again here in the shadows so that we can really try to turn form on those. We are going to, I planned early on that we were going to have him mostly shadowed on our side of his form, so I needed to really make sure that I was selling all of the topographical information in this shadow pass. I've also mentioned before that I'm starting to use a lot more supplementary shadow layers, where it's just me throwing in an extra one and saying, okay, I need a little bit more definition here. So instead of it being at like a full opacity, it is at a reduced opacity, so I can just add just enough of a change. That happens a little bit here. I can't say that I'll be able to pick it out every time. I know that when we get done with this first pass, there's a little bit of work done underneath his trapezius muscles and by like his neck muscles and tendons, but that's like the only thing I can really think of off the top of my head, but we'll see it when we get there. One thing that's interesting with these layers turning on and off is you can see my layer setup for this. I actually split him up a lot, but the nice thing is, since he's muscular, I could split him up along his muscle groups so that it was much easier to hide where those little breaks were happening. But with me turning these layers on and off and lowering and increasing the opacity, you can see that I'm doing that so I can make sure that I separate everything. Right now that back foot is lowered in opacity so that I can separate it from the foot that is in front of it while I'm adding the shadow layer on, because since the shadow layer sits on top of everything else, it'll bleed over and then I won't know if I'm actually capturing the shadow correctly being affected by that foot that's in front of it. So this is just a way to see it more clearly. Also, I think on this one I will do a quick Procreate file deep dive so we can just look at the layers. It's been a while since I've done that, and I think it'd be good to show just how many layers are a part of the flats and a part of like all the lighting and all that kind of stuff. So we'll get to that at the end of this time lapse. Now here you'll see this little edging happening where his boot hits the sort of like tread, and then we'll put a little bit on the underside of the tread. This is a separate supplementary layer. I did it because I really did want to sell how that boot sort of comes in and plugs into that without it being a part of the core AO layers. This also rounding that you're seeing here with the shadows, that is also part of that same pass. So you can already see that there's a little bit of work being done here in a new layer just to try and sell that form a little bit better. So now we're on to the body neck head combo. All of this and then probably his arm that's closest to us were the biggest bulk of the work when it comes to the AO pass and trying to define the forms. I think his distant arm and his boots, of course, they have plenty of detail there that needs to be sold, but I think that the body, since it's just this one big mass and you really have to sell that anatomy, I think that it was just sort of like, actually it was both, okay, I got to do this right, but it was also, this is the juiciest part to work on, like the part that's just kind of the most fun. I do really like his expression in this. He's got this sad sort of longing look, but he's still kind of stern at the same time. The Maxx is kind of weird because you play with such limited features, but then if you just pair it with the right sentence, or you imagine the Maxx's voice from the cartoon and all these things, I mean, it just works really well. He's a very sympathetic character, and getting to that face stuff is just really fun. Here I want to also point out that yellow that's on his sort of like nose, forehead thing, as well as the yellow that is claws. They have no definition in this. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes he would be drawn with actual detail in those parts, other times he wouldn't. It just depends. I like actually that I like that quality of the art style where it's just like, we have rules for it unless we don't need the rules, and then we don't use the rules, and that is really fun to me. So I just decided to go with the no definition version because I think it's the most iconic. It's one of the most memorable aspects of his design. So all of the yellow in this When I got to those layers, I just selected them, cleared them from the shadow, and then moved on. Same thing is more or less true with the black sort of like tar-like part that connects his gloves and his arms, except that those are just straight black. So it doesn't really even matter if they get cleared at all, because a multiply on a black won't show up with anything. One thing that is also interesting to note is that the AO pass that I'm doing on him, since I turn these lines on and off, I keep getting this sort of reaffirmation of having lines involved. Where that first manifests then is when I'm done with this AO pass, I actually will duplicate it because I want it all to be a little bit darker. I think I also adjust the opacity slightly of the duplication, but it does bring a slightly higher contrast to his definition. Then on top of that, later in the piece, I decide, hey, let's bring in lines. I mean, the Maxx had lines a lot of the time. It was, like I said, it was a very sort of nomadic art style, or sort of like fluid art style. It was just like whatever served the scene is how it would be done, or at least that's how I view it from the outside. So I include lines in amongst this sort of more painterly stuff, and to try and sort of touch on its like comic roots and the line driven art form that it is. Okay, we're done with the boots, the sort of weird leathery, clothy, wrapping type boot things he has. And now we're moving on to his arm. This is the final major part for the AO. And then we will start moving into other things, mostly the big shadow block, but then we go into some of the more stylistic aspects of the rendering of this. Something I want to also call out is that, again, art style that tried so many different things, which was really cool. But I think the most iconic Maxx look had like these heavy black shadows. I considered doing something like that. However, part of any exercise, I think, where you're interpreting an existing character is you want to put your spin on it. Otherwise, why do it? So I didn't want to do that. I wanted to keep like the way I light things and the way I sort of paint form, and then bring in enough of the character so that it looks like the character, and then enough of the style so that it looks like it's referencing the style. I feel like those three things are kind of like the key qualities to making good fan art, I think. It's like you want to respect the designs of the world, you want to respect the style that it comes from, and then you want to do your own thing with it so that there's a reason why you're doing it. So here we're getting the last bits of that arm shading in. And then we will go to the big solid shadow. Of course, we will also drop out for a second so that you can see the duplication of the shadow. It'll happen really quickly, but you'll see it just sort of like snap to a slightly darker look. Now we're into the big fill shadow that's filling in basically all the side. If you remember that really rough black background that I put in, there's a light coming from behind him. It's almost like a door is open. And so that is the lighting source for this, the light source. So here we're going through, and some of this is pretty quick, especially the parts that are just largely in shadow. Just select that flat, and then up top on the shadow layer, fill it in, and then erase away where the lines, where the light is. It's very similar to how I paint when I'm doing color picking, because I paint from shadows up to lights. This is similar, except you're applying the shadow and then erasing it away. It's almost like you're painting with the light part instead of painting the shadows in. So here you'll see I also, on the yellow for this, I don't do any kind of lighting. I just thought it would be nice and stylistic that way. So here is the part of his body that's actually getting the most light, that arm that's in front. Otherwise, everything is pretty much in shadow with just some little key bits getting touched by that light. We're also using this opportunity where we can to help further define the form. Like for instance, where that elbow pokes out, by having that catch that light in that way and have that hard shadow. It works out quite well. Here I'm just making that background less noisy, and then I'm changing the way the shadow, where the light is laid. Technically the shadow as well, but so that we can really get this look of this grungy sort of floor, that sort of, nondescript yellow grunge that's in the Maxx a lot of the time in the surfaces. Then I changed the lighting of the shadows from warm to cool, more of like a purple, because it just fit. It just felt more Maxx, I guess, in a way. And now I don't know what's happening. We threw some paint speckle in there as well, just to add a little bit of extra texture to them. I also just scrubbed back and forth like 100 times and didn't see any changes, so I don't know what some of that was, but it was there nonetheless. Now we are throwing in that word bubble. That word bubble to me is an important part of the illustration, so I wanted to make sure it was in there. I put it in just with that color, hand wrote in Julie, and then started scratching away at it with black. Instead of erasing it, I just used black paint since it was on top of black anyways. Now we're throwing on this texture, which I love for general grunge, setting it to like an overlay, and then lowering its opacity. That's interesting actually, how long it took to do that. I wonder if they changed the way that's all being captured now? I don't know. I don't know how they would change it without me updating it. So I'm just making shit up now, but that was really slow, and that's really cool because then you can actually see what I was changing through. Okay, to move on, now you'll see the lines getting added in. I also did this with the rough ink brush that is in my brush set, just because I thought it'd work. Oh, right there, you really quickly see a bunch of white get laid in on the left and laid in on the right. I was just trying to figure out exactly where I wanted my brightest rim light to be. I decided to go on the side with the light source. I then just put in a little bit of overlay. You could see me filling it in, and then I used my shadow layer to erase away, and that was to lighten that part. We're starting to really strengthen the fact that that's the light source, and then using this white with a bit of yellow to it to put in a rim light from that way. I thought that this felt the most in style with the look and feel of the Maxx, while also bringing in some of my own thing. Here is just a really soft bounce light so that we can add a little bit more dimension to his shadow side. It's just a really low opacity, like tan color, sort of keying off the color of the floor, assuming maybe there's some more light in that room, bouncing off of like a wall that is that colored surface. We also added a little bit of gradient in his yellow hands. You can see that popped in at some point that I don't recall, but so now we're at the very end where it's just going to be little tweaks here or there. Sign the picture, add a little bit of edging at the top just so that it has some cool distress going on, and right there, that's the final version of the image. But let's go ahead and jump into the Procreate file. Okay, so here is the Procreate file. You can see here, let's just zoom in for a bit so we can see sort of like what the resolution looks like that I work at, just so that we can also cover that, because that comes up a lot. Canvas information, you You can see there it is 2,400 pixels by 3,600 pixels. If you're keeping track at home, that is 8 inches by 12 inches at 300 dpi, although that information is meaningless. Let's get back to this. Here are the layers. Let's start turning a bunch of stuff off so that we can start seeing what we're working with here. So we've got this sort of like baby poop brown background. Here are the flats. You can see that in the flats for the boots there was some green gunking up added at one point. We have this gradient that was done with like one of the chalk brushes, just again trying to capture some of the look and feel from the comic. I also threw in these quick paint splatters. This is all just to add a little bit of extra noise. Those paint splatters, by the way, if you are wondering, are right here. They're overlay, they're white. Let's crank them all the way up and set them to normal for a minute. You can see right there. So if we take them to overlay and bring them back down to 14% or whatever they were, and there. Procreate really needs like a tap and type the number. See, if I tap on the number, it does that. Anyways, we've almost got it back. Okay, good enough. Okay, right on the money. So there is the, this is the flats. This is how they are. The only thing that's like super clean really is the black splatter, because I wanted to make sure I got that as precise as possible. But you can see the color variation in the purple. Let me turn off that splatter again so you can see a little bit better. That's what the new turpentine brush does. It creates some variation. Turn this back on. You can see that the Julie word bubble is just drawn over the top in black because it's on black, so I didn't bother to do anything too fancy with that. It does have a little bit of a gradient. The same gradient done with the gloves, where it's like a little bit of a chalky thing. And then we have, here's the lines. You can see those in their blurry glory. This is from some old photo I had of it. Just get rid of those for a second. And now we get into all of the stuff that makes up the lighting for this. I'm going to turn this all on. Oh, it's actually kind of nice without the black. It makes it look like it's on like craft paper. That's kind of cool. Look at, see, this is the thing, man. Art's about some happy accidents too. Okay, so we've got this layer, which is our AO, which you can see right there, set to multiply, and its core color is that. Let's go back to multiply. And then a second one, turn that on. That's set to 40%, because if we go up, it's just a little too much. So we keep it at 40% just to take the edge off, but still to bring some of that darkness. Then we get into this, which is our sort of supplementary AO layer, where you can see underneath his trapezius, a little bit underneath his neck, where his foreground arm is cast onto his body. And then a little bit going on the boots as well. Then we have the big heavy shadow. This is filling the entire part. Like it's basically 80%, 85% in shadow. Then we have a little bit of a hot edge. And then here is the layer that makes a little bit more intensity. We're getting more contrast. This is an add layer, which is just white, I believe, and normal. Is that pure white? Are my eyes working? It is pure white. Okay, my eyes, I guess, technically aren't working because I wasn't sure of that. So let's go quickly through the rest of it. We've got a rim light. Then we've got a duplication of that rim light that's been blurred and set to add and is colorized a little bit orangey yellow. And so if I turn that back to the way it was, that's what it looks like when it's add, and then that's what it looks like with its opacity turned down. Here's our bounce, or fill, I guess. And then here are the lines thrown in all over. You know, I said that this was with the rough ink, but it might not be. Oh no, I think it most definitely is. Nope, I think that is... No, that's way too blurry. It's got to be with the rough ink. See, look at what I go through to make sure I'm accurate. I don't know now. I don't know what it is. Experiment, have fun. Art's a journey. It's not about prescribed directions. Oh, you can also see that the lines go like off the figure a lot, and that's because, again, it's going to be on black, so it doesn't matter. Then we have a little bit of shine in his eye. Here's the, oh, let me turn on the background so we can actually see the distressing. So here's the background. You can see there's subtle texture work, just trying to capture the look and feel from the comic. And then if we go back up here, we're going to turn on the distressing. This was just done with some random brushes in the brush sets. Like, you know, when I say random, I mean like down here in industrial, like using like the wasteland brush or the heavy metal brush and then just messing with it some more. Then we've got this texture, which is set to overlay at 37%, and then the same texture set to multiply at 36%. This is just to give a balance. There's a reason why both of these exist, and they both have to exist in order to get this exact look that we're going for. I then have a little bit of an extra texture slapped on the word bubble just to make it even more damaged and, you know, in the look and feel, and then just my signature, and that's it. So you can see that when we're looking at the flats, which here they all are, it's like back arm, back hand, legs, back boot, body, mouth quote unquote, eye, front boot, front arm, and then front hand plus forehead decal, and then all the black gunk on one layer, and then the splatter and all the other stuff. So you can see that it's fairly, this one's really simple with the flats and then gets a little bit more complex with all of these various color layers. To be honest, it's not that these are, this isn't a complex setup, it's just that they're all doing really nuanced things. Things like making this brightness just the right level of brightness, and making this bounce look right, and making these textures look right. And really this just comes from trial and error, which then trial and error and doing ends up becoming experience, which then means you can just decide on these things a little bit more easily on your own in the future. And that's the final piece, a tribute to one of my favorite characters. If you don't know who he is, I encourage you to go check him out and go check out that comic book and cartoon. If you do know who he is, I hope this lived up to your image of him as well. So thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing, and I will see you on the next one. And if you're looking for me on the internet, these are the places where you can find me.